out of Afghanistan the way we've actually managed it. There is at least one, and maybe more, smaller, quieter success story where the U.S., with other countries, which is a key point we can come back to later, looked at a society that had lost the ability to keep itself out of the abyss and helped it crawl back out. In some cases, still just hanging on to the edge. In other cases, moving quite a bit further away from the edge. And that is a net positive, not just for that country, not just for human rights, not just for our vague sense of not liking to see dead and chlorine-gassed babies on our TV screens, but for our own security for the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning. And with all due respect, Joe, this is something we know how to do, actually. One of the many tragedies of Iraq is that everybody who knew anything, who had learned painfully the hard lessons of all the things we did wrong and some of the things we did right in the Clinton administration, was systematically sidelined before Iraq started. So where there were lessons to be learned, we comprehensively failed to learn them. Where there were lessons to be learned from successes subsequently, frankly, the Obama administration chose not to deploy them in Libya and said, oh, the Europeans will take care of what comes after. And that didn't work out so well. But one of the lessons we've learned, which is something that Joe pointed to, is that actually the military is the smallest part. And that some of your most successful interventions, the military is not used at all in the sense of actually fire. Macedonia, US and NATO troops and EU forces never fired a shot. All they had to do was be there. So Joe is absolutely right. And the things we do, in fact, know how to do in intervention are mostly not military. The tragedy, or one of the tragedies of the post 9/11 period, is that we've systematically moved responsibility for dealing with pre-conflict and post-conflict situations over to the Pentagon because we're so in love with funding the Pentagon as a shortcut for patriotism. And the Pentagon does what it was set up to do, which is break things and hurt people. And you know, you can walk the halls of the Pentagon and very easily find very senior people who will say, we don't want to be in charge of the schools in Iraq. We don't want to be in charge of women's health in Afghanistan. We recognize that somebody has to do those things. We recognize that you can't get a society out of a spiral of conflict without those things. We even invite in the people from USAID and the people from the humanitarian groups who have done really good peer-reviewed studies on what combination of money and training and job opportunity actually works to pull societies back out of a spiral of conflict. But then guess what? Those folks don't get money to implement it. The Pentagon gets money to implement it. So you have some very well-intentioned 26-year-old officer who, you know, maybe he's a reservist and he's a school teacher, or maybe before she joined the military, she had done some nursing. And they're told, oh, put together a public health program. Oh, you know, figure out how to rebuild the schools. And that's not the best use. It's not the best use of their skills and talents. It's not the best use of what America has to offer. And it's certainly not going to work very well. And it's going to give you failed models of intervention and really embarrassing stories of just catastrophic waste of U.S. resources, which lead people to say the kinds of things that Joe said about intervention being bad and we don't know how to do it. And I have absolutely no idea how much time I've taken up, because there I just had so much fun talking. But so we're in danger as a society, and frankly, especially us on the left, of always assuming that everything is about us, and either we are the greatest or we are the worst. And either we can fix it and we can turn your war-torn country into Switzerland, which is never true, or we turn everything we touch to poop, and we shouldn't do anything. And that is just as much a delusion. It's in fact the same delusion as the folks who think, oh, we're going to ride in, it's going to be a cakewalk, and then it's going to be Switzerland. Or it would be really easy to overthrow the North Korean regime and install a democracy there, to circle back to current events. And in fact, the really interesting thing is that the people who, Joe's absolutely right, the people who are going to fix a society are the members of the society. You imagine to yourself, aliens show up and say, hey, we're going to fix what's wrong with the U.S. politically. Welcome to our new alien overlords.
Maybe now, I don't know.
Yeah, but then they say, actually, we aliens, we don't like glasses. Or, in our alien culture, we really look down on people who like Game of Thrones. So you're going to have democracy except for you Game of Thrones viewers. Or some other thing that's just totally incomprehensible to us. So the both great failure and great potential of American interventionism is that we have the ability, we have the tools. In our country, we tend to have people who speak the language, who know the cultures, who've maybe immigrated from the places. We have the ability to go be helpful. And the other thing that's really interesting is that usually the folks in a society who are trying to fix it and rebuild it have studied, for example, the work of Martin Luther King, have studied, for example, bringing down a dictator, the seminal story of how Serbian activists used Dr. King's theory and Gandhi's work and American nonviolence experts to change the government of their country, Serbia. So those networks and our ability to actually support people in countries intervening and changing their own societies, those networks are all there. What we don't have, and this is where I can circle back to current events a little bit, what we don't have is a construct of foreign affairs that says that that's a legitimate way to do business or that that's a legitimate way to spend American resources. And instead of that, we have, and Joe, I'm with Henry on this one. The way I put it is the Trump administration may not have a grand strategy, but it has fundamentals. And some of its fundamentals, frankly, are to focus on certain cultural qualities that really just fail to see the resources that we have in this country to make connections with and support and lift up folks who are trying to improve themselves in other countries and who don't need us to do it for them and who don't want us to do it, just like we didn't want the British to do it for us 200 and change years ago, but who could sure use some help and some resources. And instead of that, you have an administration that says, yeah, we don't need to plan. Planning is for wimps. And consistency is for wusses. And, if you plan, that just means they're going to know what you're going to do, except, like, we're going to announce today that we're going to announce tomorrow what we're going to do, so presumably everyone does know what you're going to do. But like I said, consistency is for wimps. So this isn't something that Trump started. You can read the histories of Vietnam, you can read histories actually back to the Spanish-American War. This is never something that Americans have been good at. And the funny thing is, every war, every conflict, there's somebody who pops up and says, what if we listen to the locals? And every war, every conflict, every time those people, they fight their way fairly far up the chain, and then they get marginalized and pushed aside. And they write memoirs afterwards, and they say, oh, we could have won the Vietnam War if only. There's literally a book out about a guy named Edward Lansdale saying, oh, we could have won the Vietnam War if only we'd listened to Lansdale. But one of those pops up every time, because we're both a country that's really good at listening, at reaching out, at making these connections. We're the country that creates the literature on how to overthrow a dictator peacefully. We're the country that created the academic study that shows over the long term nonviolence is a more effective strategy than violence. Anyone ever read that? Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stepan, you should all be ashamed of yourselves. It's one of the seminal works of 21st century political science. It was written right here in America, actually by a University of Colorado graduate, is one of the authors, and no one's ever heard of it. Because we have in our society, in who we are as a people, all the tools to do intervention in a way that's actually valuable and helpful, but that's not who we tell ourselves we are. So we don't know, and you all look at me and say, intervention is terrible and we should never do it. Thank you.
Well, following Heather and Joe is going to be a challenge for me. I was a practicing diplomat for 30 years, but I worked in the economic area. But I guess I would just start with the statement that as someone who worked for 30 years public service, is that I truly believe that it's the destiny of this country to in fact promote its values around the world. Not force it on everybody, but certainly promote and represent our values. And it's actually in many ways, America is a very unique, well, not very, it's a unique country in the world. And other countries see us as a symbol. And yes, people get unhappy with our arrogance. Yes, people resent our leadership, but people fear our lack of leadership even more. And we're certainly seeing that around the part of the world that I know best, Asia. I would maybe focus a little bit more on, particularly in some of the failings we've had in interventions, on the strategic versus execution areas. And so strategically, there's lots of good reasons why we went to Vietnam. Strategically, there were good reasons why we got rid of a man like Saddam Hussein, who had invaded his neighboring country, who had forced us to put troops in Saudi Arabia that then became the seminal force behind the rise of terrorism. So what we didn't do well in both those cases was execution. And I was involved, since you've raised Iraq, let me talk a little bit about it. I was the head of the Iraq Economic Task Force in the State Department during the occupation, and we did a terrible job. And the reason for that, however, was not lack of planning. There was extensive planning that went on months before the invasion that had been done through an interagency process. And with the involvement of a lot of Iraqi, mainly the Iraqi diaspora, parts of it. But as Heather correctly points out, those plans were, after the invasion, were quickly put in the trash can, and the Defense Department decided to go on its own and kind of shoot from the hip, and we got a predictable result. So it's true that we have problems with execution. Again, whether that was a bad strategic mistake to remove Saddam Hussein or not, I think is still a debatable question. Let me talk a little bit. I mean, I wanted to go back to Joe's point also about intervention is just not about military intervention, obviously, and Heather made the same point. Use of military obviously is a tool of many, and you have many other tools that you're using when you're trying to promote national interests through diplomacy, and it's the last tool that you use, right? It's the tool of last resort. We've had, and in the economic area, I was involved mainly in interventions that were obviously more about, promoting our economic interests, opening up markets, and creating an international environment which would help the American economy. And there also, we took a very interventionist policy or approach. That is, we got into the knickers of lots of different of our trading partners, telling them how they should structure their economy and how they should run their markets. It was considered arrogant, but there was always a very large group of people in those countries who supported just that agenda. And so we worked with those, and you work you find your allies within every country whether you're doing any kind of diplomacy. Work with those allies to make change, and that's how you get things done. Again, if you can, in many ways, you have to. It'd be nice if we could do this without being arrogant, but in fact, we don't seem to be capable of that. But my point is that the results, I think, are good at the end, and you just have to live with the side effect of being arrogant. I would. Yeah, let me also point out that let's look a bit more at the speak softly and carry a big stick, of course, is what Teddy Roosevelt said. And, Teddy Roosevelt, despite his reputation, I think, was actually a president who spent a lot of time on diplomacy, on talking, and in fact, as you know, got the Nobel Prize for his work in getting the Portsmouth Treaty, the treaty that ended the Japanese-Russian War, for those efforts. And so when he said speak softly and carry a big stick, he was focusing on the talk side, and not the stick side. Now, the stick side matters because to have credibility when you're talking, you need two things. You need power and the ability to project power. Not necessarily, you don't necessarily have to do that, but you have to have the perception that you're powerful and can't be screwed around with. But at the same time, you need trust, and you have to have both of those elements to be able to be a successful negotiator. Teddy Roosevelt did that through a lot of hard work and also the U.S. And we do that today. And Heather mentioned a number of examples where we use the many resources we have. We have our aid programs. We have programs that create strong ties between the peoples of different countries, and all that matters. We have grassroots programs that create good feelings between peoples of countries, between foreign countries and Americans, and that every single bit of that matters when it comes to diplomacy and solving big problems. And so, one of the concerns I have about the current administration is that obviously they seem to be eroding the trust that we've created over the years, and that trust I believe, can be won back, but it's going to take some time. The other thing, I guess, I'll just say last word on interventionism is drawing red lines, and so and this goes to the speak loudly part, I guess. If you're going to it's good to speak loudly if you want to talk about what your interests are and what you want done. So, for example, for North Korea, we should be very clear that denuclearization is the goal and the objective, and it may take a while to get there, but that's the objective. We should be very clear about it. When we start talking about red lines, that if you don't get rid of your nuclear weapons, we're going to visit fire and fury on your country, or in the case of President Obama in Syria, that if you use chemical warfare, we're going to do something that's a red line. That's where it's actually just it's poor tactics, because once you've drawn that red line, you've limited yourself, and you don't want to put yourself in that position. So I think, again, when you talking loudly about your interests, what you want out of a deal is good. We want China to stop stealing intellectual property, fine. We want them to let internet companies in, fine. We are going to sanction you for $100 billion worth of goods. When you've shot that shot, it's shot. You've lost your leverage. So it's just, I think, poor tactics. So how you intervene is also very important. So let me just stop there. Thank you.
Well, I hesitate to begin. I have spoken to a lot of audiences over my lifetime where my point of view has not been terribly popular, and I'm remembering one incident in particular in the mid-1990s when I was debating someone. I went to Williams College where I used to teach, and I was debating someone there, and before I started I asked the audience, I said, how many people here voted for Ronald Reagan, just to try to get a sense of their partisan preferences, and one hand went up in the back. One hand. When I checked that hand, it happened to be my wife. So I'm not expecting a lot of clapping here when I finish. Look, I think America has done a very credible job, maybe even sensational job, on intervention where it has counted. And I'm thinking in particular now about our post-World War II policy in Germany and in Japan. Today's world would be a much worse world if Europe were not whole and free, and if Japan and South Korea, Taiwan were not democracies in Asia. Now, we did that with a combination of tools, but not without the military. Containment scared the hell out of people. Nuclear weapons scared the hell out of people. Deterrence scared the hell out of people. And it was a very risky and tricky period, but I am very grateful that we had two presidents, and I put them in the same order, one at the origins of the Cold War and the other at the end of the Cold War, Harry Truman and Ronald Reagan, who understood that it was important for us to try to make the world a better place if we could, not simply accept that world of great power politics and balance of payments that had existed in Europe for so many years, and that we could, in fact, encourage democracy in other countries, that in order to do so, we were going to have to deal with some very big problems. The biggest problem we face are authoritarian countries. in 1945, a totalitarian country in the case of Stalinist Russia. These regimes, these governments, use force at will on their own people. So they're going to use it against you in international relations. And yes, you have the military capability and the credibility, as Larry was suggesting, to stop them. That is to tell them, look, you're not going to get your will by means of force. So most of our use of force, I think, especially in that early period, were defensive uses of force to say to our authoritarian rivals, you can't get your objectives outside on the ground. You can't achieve your objectives by sweeping across Eastern Europe and possibly even further because we have the power to stop you. So let's really talk seriously in the negotiations. I mean, this was Ronald Reagan's approach to the end of the Cold War. You have to remember, we were somewhat behind the curve in the 1970s, had a very poor economy, had lost our morale because of Watergate and Vietnam. Our military was in bad shape, and the Soviet Union was on a roll. Was projecting power for the first time beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, et cetera. Reagan had an enormous task to turn the economy around, to turn the military around, so that he could say to the Soviets, all right, look, I'm really interested in negotiations. He always said that, by the way. You can go back to the campaign comments he made in 1980. I'm for a military buildup pending negotiations. He wanted to say to the Soviets, look, you're not going to get your way by deploying intermediate range nuclear missiles in Europe and then expecting that we won't respond. You're not going to get your way by proxy forces in Central America. We're going to fight back. Now, let's come to the table and let's talk sense. You know, Gorbachev got that message, and there's a very telling comment that he made to the Politburo in October of 1986. Now, this is right before Reykjavik. And he told his colleagues, he says, you know what? We are not going to be able to compete with the United States in the next arms race. We will lose. That was the moment at which the Soviet Union began to get serious about reducing nuclear weapons and about changing, all right, changing their intervention in Eastern Europe and ultimately bring about the changes that ended the Cold War. Now, since the end of the Cold War, we've been sort of torn between at least a couple of schools of thought. You know, a lot of people at the end of the Cold War thought, hey, look, we've done the job now. Why can't we just come home? And why can't we just concentrate on America? And that movement, by the way, is still there in our debate. There are people who say over and over again, colleagues of mine, conservative colleagues, who say, look, we won the Cold War, let's just get the troops out of Europe and Japan. What are we doing? That's one school of thought that's still there. And by the way, I'm not sure that Trump isn't part of that school. He clearly has an instinct to stay out of Afghanistan, to stay out of Syria. So while there is a chance, as Jim suggested, that he might, get us into all kinds of other wars, there's also a chance he might pull back, and we might get some of the same results, by the way, that Obama got. That is, we didn't get peace. We got Russian aggression. We got Chinese aggression. The world stays pretty bad no matter what we do in some cases. But I will say this, the world after 1991 has not been as bad as the world during the Cold War. So I think that nationalist orientation is probably not appropriate. We have others then, realists, who argue we ought to simply defend ourselves and our allies, and we ought to not worry about spreading democracy. We should give up this idea of bringing countries closer, making human rights more widespread and helping countries to develop more democratic systems. Finally, a third school, and that's the one I hear loudly at this table, is to, through diplomacy and through economic means, to try to spread our basic values, and to try to do this, by the way, mostly through multilateralism. That is, through working through institutions where we work with others, where we develop with them a habit of compromise, where we restrain ourselves, and that gives them trust and confidence in us. And that's all well and good. I'm actually all for that. If there were not in the world people like Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi, I'd be a member of that school of sort of how to approach these problems. But look, I don't think that's the approach that they respect. I mean, Obama tried to reset policies with Russia. He actually gave up a lot in the approach to Russia. What did he get? He got Russian aggression in Crimea and the eastern part of Ukraine. He started out with a strategic partnership with China. What did he get? He got Chinese aggression in the South and East China Sea. So my view is you've got to be willing to meet the challenges that are posed by the fact that authoritarian governments are going to use force more readily than we will. Now, I will end my comment by saying that at this stage, given where we are after the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, which have not gone well, I agree with Larry that the interventions themselves were justified, but the execution was poor. My view is that we can't do this for more than 2 or 3 years. We should never go into these remote regions to deal with terrorism or other problems and not get out in 2 or 3 years. I think Iraq would have been a great success if we'd have gotten out. Put another government in place, it would have been better than Saddam Hussein. And if things went wrong again in 4 or 5 years, we could always go back in. But the American people have very, and good, by the way, there's a good fact. They're very short-tempered about wars. You know, we almost ended the Civil War in the summer of 1864 because the country was tired of that war. We haven't had a war that has lasted more than 3 or 4 years until these recent wars. So maybe that's the lesson we ought to draw from Afghanistan and Iraq. We don't go into those countries that are outside the main perimeters of freedom in the world, but we stay in the conflict that is for the regimes that are at stake along the major frontiers of freedom, which are in Europe and Asia. That means today the Ukraine problem, that's a much more important problem in my judgment than Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and then in Asia, the Korean problem. Those are the 2 problems that could really throw us on track and cause, by the way, democracy to lose a lot of the gains that it made since 1945. In other parts of the world, I really think we ought to try to attack terrorism, that is, keep terrorism off balance, but not try to invest ourselves in an effort to try to build democracies in those countries. I'm not sure yet that Trump isn't, in fact, on that particular path. He's done some things. I'll leave it here. We'll talk about it during the course of the thing. But he's done some things in Asia. I mean, in Europe, for example, which I think are right on the mark. He's strengthened the alliance for all the, babble about NATO is obsolete, et cetera. He's standing up to Putin. He's not cowering to Putin. He's standing up to him. Two clear examples of that. No, look at the big things, I think, in this case. Look at the fact that we've deployed American troops on the borders of Russia for the first time since 1991. That's a big, big factor. And you wouldn't do that if you were trying to play footsies with Putin. He's also given offensive weapons to the Kiev government to stop any further Russian aggression, or at least raise the cost of any further Russian aggression in Ukraine. Obama didn't do that. So Trump is not, I don't think you can't pay a lot of attention to what he says or what he does. You need to pay attention to what happens. You need to pay attention to what happens. I'll concede that. But pay attention to what happens. And what about Asia? He's got discussions going with North Korea. How did he do that? He did that by, close cooperation with China, by some blustering with North Korea, and bingo, we've got them coming to the table. I don't hold out a lot of hope for those negotiations. We've been negotiating with North Korea for 2 decades, and we haven't gotten very far. But those are big things, and he's followed through. Now he faces a really tough problem in Syria. He would like to get out, but the Middle East is an area where I don't think we have the kinds of interests at stake that we do in Europe and Asia, but we do have some basic interests there, most importantly Israel. And how he handles that is going to be very, very important. But I'm ready to give him the benefit of the doubt since he's done pretty well so far, in my judgment. Thank you.
So thanks to all the panelists for their very, very informed and interesting comments. I think very quickly I just add 2 comments. It seems to me that actions have consequences, and among these consequences are setting precedents. If we have troops on the Russian border, what would you do if the Russians have troops along the Mexican border? We sell weapons to Ukraine. What happened when the Russians tried to export missiles to Cuba? We all know that. It's easy to justify intervention when our interests and values are aligned. But when they are in conflict, interests and values, sometimes non-intervention speaks volumes. And what leaps to my mind is what happened in Rwanda. And for those of you who remember Rwanda, you should read Samantha Power's comments on the failure of our diplomacy, our sitting on the sideline, failing to do something when knowing that atrocities were being committed. right? So non-intervention speaks volumes too. Now, I think what I would like to do next is to invite the panelists to maybe respond to each other's comments, give them a chance to talk to each other, and then maybe open up to the audience for questions. Joe, would you like to say anything in reaction to the other people's comments?
You know, I think I just have a question, and this gets to your last point about liberal interventionism, and this is the toughest part I have, and I guess maybe for Heather first. Did you think we should have intervened in Syria earlier? Do you think we should have done that? Or do you think we should have intervened in Rwanda? I mean, this is, you know, one of the benefits of this conference is you get to think out loud. You get to explore some ideas here, and this is one of the toughest ones for me because I'm sympathetic. You want to stop these atrocities. I mean, shouldn't we stop these atrocities? And yet I come up with my feeling that when we have tried to intervene for the best of reasons, we have created more of a disaster than we intended. And what I mean by that is not the low intensity conflicts like the ones you mentioned. We have a decided advantage in those, but the tougher ones, like Syria or like Rwanda, where it's not easy to have a low-profile military interventions. How do you deal with those?
So I get the easy question. Conveniently, I shot my mouth off about this on Twitter last night, so I'm already on the record on this one. The interesting thing is that many, not all, but many conflicts, even that we think of as being very high intensity, had a low intensity phase. So, for example, for Rwanda, the assertion is made, I believe Samantha makes it in the book. Henry, I'll be curious your view on the historicity of this, that a substantial number of the killings in Rwanda could have been averted by jamming the hate radio. That you actually would not have had, you wouldn't have had to send troops that fired a shot, you would have had to send a jammer plane. And that in fact there was some consideration given to sending a jammer plane and decision was made not to do it. So in the case of Syria, Joe, I mean what I'm on the record saying is that I think the moment to intervene in the broad sense of the word was in 2011, 2012, when you had a broad-based civilian nonviolent opposition to the Assad regime, which people may remember during the Arab Spring. Now, having said that, I'm also a realist in the sense that I believe in looking at the world as it actually is. And Assad was always determined to burn down his country in order to save his family's hold on power. Always. So I don't believe that there's some magic moment that we could have done something either military or non-military that would have prevented conflict in Syria. But I do believe that we could have made the bar higher for Assad, and we could have made the bar higher for the other countries in the region, who then all decided that it was in their interest to fuel the conflict in the 2012 to 2014 period, when the levels of killing were at their absolute worst. And so I think we would still have ended up with a terrible situation, but that we could have ended up with a situation that is several magnitudes less terrible. And since you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who would be alive, also, by the way, if we hadn't had a refugee crisis of the magnitude that we had, you might have some different political outcomes in some parts of Europe than you did have. So that's my answer. While I'm talking, Henry, I don't know you. We've never met before. I have a huge respect for your work, but you know that it was Barack Obama who signed the orders for the troops to be deployed to the border states. It wasn't Trump. That was set up by the Obama administration before he left office. And you surely also know that Trump decided to do the summit with the North Koreans without telling the Chinese, and they told the Chinese afterwards. So it's not the case that this is a highly coordinated, smoothly oiled machine.
I don't think Henry said that last part.
Yeah, that's true. You did.
Well, China's reacted very, very mildly to Trump so far, and what has been a rather, heavy-handed policy towards North Korea. And I think that suggests that Trump and Xi they're on the same wavelength. China has put more pressure on the North Koreans in the last 18 months than they have before. Whatever it is, I don't know what the chemistry is of their relationship, but I think Trump is absolutely right. You're not going to get a solution in Korea, a peaceful solution in Korea, without the Chinese. All right. At the same time, the Chinese have a maybe indelible interest in the North Korean regime remaining in place because they don't want it to collapse, and they certainly don't want the South Korean regime to spread to their border. So this is a really dicey sort of issue for the Chinese. I think Trump has just done it very well. He's also coordinated very well with the South Koreans, a dovish government in South Korea, which you would think he would have some problems with. They went ahead and deployed the missile defense system that we sent to them, and he's been able to stay on the same wavelength with them, even though they're clearly more eager for these negotiations than Trump was. Again, I'm not expecting a lot to come out of those discussions, but if we could keep them going, I mean, North Korea is a problem that we're just going to have to live with, but we're going to have to move it in one direction or the other. At some point, we're going to have to get a resolution to this question. They can't get nuclear weapons that can hit the western part or other parts of the United States. That simply is not going to be an outcome that we will accept, or that I think that generally the American people will accept. I would, again, my view is that we need to make an assessment in every situation, whether it's Rwanda, whether it's Syria, whether it's Ukraine. We need to make an assessment of how much will we lose if authoritarian countries gained influence in those countries. Those are the countries that are on the borders of freedom. Look, the world's different today and better today because we've got a Europe that's holding free. So anything that sets back democracy in Europe, and it's starting to happen now to some extent in Poland and Hungary, is not a good thing. It's going to really damage our interests over the long run. So when there's a conflict like Ukraine, that's the conflict I really want to focus on. And I want to stand in there, not just for the purpose of stopping the Russians, but also for the purpose of saying to the Ukrainian government, look, someday you'll have the chance to make your own mind. Make up your own. The citizens of Ukraine will have a chance to decide whether they want to be a part of NATO or a part of the European Union. Not now. I'm not advocating that at the moment, but I'm saying we keep open that option. The same thing is true for a united Korea. We keep open the option for a united Korea that it will be free. That's absolutely central, it seems to me, to our relationship with South Korea and to our whole position in Asia. If we lose democracy on the Korean Peninsula, how do you think that's going to affect Japan or Taiwan? We're going to be back to square one in Asia. Now, all of the other conflicts are outside of those regions. Afghanistan, we were attacked from Afghanistan. We should have gone in and hit the terrorists, which we did, and then we should have gotten out, in my judgment, or left behind only a few trainers. Iraq, I think there was enough justification, and certainly the U.S. Congress did, and many Democrats did, felt that there was reasons to go into Iraq in 2003. That has become now, a lot of second guessing, obviously, since then. And by the way, it's affected us almost the way Vietnam did. I hope we get over it, because we should. We made a mistake in the execution. I agree with Larry completely, but let's move on. It's not that critical. And even today in the Middle East, Syria is not that critical. No, I don't think I would have wanted a major intervention earlier. What I would have wanted is a clear decision on exactly how are we going to hit back against Iran. The Obama administration had no idea how to hit back against Iran. They were going to make a friend of Iran, and Iran was going to change its behavior in the region. Iran hasn't done that yet. Maybe the jury's still out. But at least Trump's got some idea of how to do this. He wants to rally the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, Egypt, possibly Turkey, all right, to try to preserve our one interest in the western part of Iraq and the eastern part of Syria, and that is to keep the terrorists off balance. We don't have an interest in getting rid of Assad, and that was a terrible mistake on the part of Obama to say we're going to get rid of him and then do nothing about it. Too bad now we've got also Russia to contend with in the region. That's a result, obviously, of not having, it's not our fault. Russians might have done what they did anyway. But still, that's a critical, Rwanda, it would have been nice if we had some low-cost measures. You're absolutely right. Then we could have maybe done something as we did in the case of capturing Osama bin Laden, low-cost military operations. But a lot of times these interventions will not allow for low-cost activities. You're either you're either all in or you're for the most part out. And I hope that in the case of the Middle East, we find a way to stand behind Israel, to push back against Iran, but not to get involved in another large military operation in the Middle East. It's a really tough problem, and I think we ought to have, well, I would urge the American people to have some sympathy for any president who's trying to deal with it. Obama had his chance, now give Trump his chance.
Yeah, well, I guess actually I wanted to go back, and it relates a little bit to the discussion here. What Henry said earlier about keeping our wars to 2 to 3 years, and it goes to the domestic political factor that goes into policy. So policy making obviously is not just a bunch of smart people like Henry and Heather and Joe sitting in Washington D.C. deciding what the policy is going to be. It's a reflection of what Americans feel and think and how they're going to vote in the next election. So the impact of what people like everyone in this room think is actually quite large, and so it's you can see it obviously in the way that we kind of go back and forth in terms of use of military force. And so after Vietnam, we had a period, as Henry just said, a period of caution and kind of a funk. Both economically as well as politically in the United States, the famous Jimmy Carter malaise, and then we had a bit more robust policies coming from President Reagan, but not a lot in terms of large conflicts. Obviously, Grenada and some more small scale, but large arms buildup in order to deter and hopefully end up resulting in changes in the Soviet Union, and then we had the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, and that was considered a success because it was relatively small, but people still had enough, and Bill Clinton ran on a pretty isolationist and protectionist platform. He didn't turn out to be isolationist or protectionist, but that's how he ran for this first election. And so we had that period of not being quite as robust, and then we had and of course 9/11 and then going into the modern period. So it's interesting to see how domestic political feelings have impacted our foreign policy, and particularly on this area of use of military force.
So we have only about a little bit more than 20 minutes left, and I really do want to get the audience's questions in. And Heather, you really had a hit, because the very first 3 questions all came in asking you the same question, identical question, which is this.
The audience is packed.
No, the answer you already gave. What's the title of the book co-authored by the 2 people you mentioned about nonviolent change? So,
I mean, isn't it the power of nonviolence? I believe it's as simple as the power of nonviolence. Ask somebody else a question, and I'll Google it to make sure I'm getting it right.
Erica Chenoweth
And Maria Stepan.
Yeah, as Heather said, she received her PhD here maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago, and I'm proud to say that I was on her thesis committee. So,
There, see, the question should go to
so
him.
that's an easy one. Okay. Next one. This is a question directed to Joe. Where are our most serious threats? Are they coming from North Korea, Russia, China, or Pakistan? What do you think, Joe?
Every year I sort of do an evaluation of our most serious nuclear threats, and I did one at the end of last year on the 5 top threats. And some of them deal with the arms race. Every single nuclear armed nation is now building new nuclear weapons. One of them dealt with the new use that people are putting them. There's a trend in the United States, in Russia, in Pakistan to build and deploy more usable nuclear weapons, to use them earlier in conflicts. And that's a very dangerous threat. Iran is not a threat to us. We have solved that nuclear program at least for a good 15 years with the agreement that we reached with our allies, with Russia, with China, with the United Nations. The danger is that this administration is going to break that deal. And John Bolton going to be the hammer that breaks that deal, and Mike Pompeo is going to help John Bolton break that deal. You do that, you let loose the Iranian nuclear program, you could unleash a new nuclear arms race in the Middle East, but you would fracture the alliance system we built up. You're looking at another war in the Middle East. This is the third great danger. The first great danger we face is North Korea, and Henry and I might agree here. You have got to stop this program in its tracks right here. This is going to be extremely difficult. Henry, you might be surprised. I believe this Trump summit might do this. I think Trump might have stumbled into something here that could actually work. This was not a plan. There is no memo in the beginning of the Trump transition that says, okay, boss, here's what we're going to do, you see? No, but things the way it worked out, there's been enough people playing with this. I think this actually could work. I'll get back to that if you want. But and we still have the problem in South Asia, as I mentioned, with Pakistan. India and Pakistan, armed with nuclear weapons, could engage in another war, and that would almost certainly go nuclear. But the number one threat to America in the world today is in the White House.
Heather, did you find out?
There's not a doubt in my mind that is true. We have a president of the United States where there are serious questions about the mental stability of the president of the United States, and you can't tippy-toe around this. You have to talk about it, not as a slur, not as some a joke, but to talk about whether the president is mentally competent and whether that man should have unfettered control over the U.S. nuclear arsenal. You have to understand this. He has the sole authority to launch nuclear weapons, and once he gives the order, no one can stop him. There would have to be a mutiny to stop the President of the United States, to stop the execution of that order. So that's bad enough. Plus, the policies that he's had towards Iran make that problem worse. Plus, the policies that he's had up until this moment, and they could change on Korea, has made that problem worse. Plus, of course, he said, let it be an arms race. We have an arms race. We're spending $1.7 trillion on new nuclear weapons. Plus, his new nuclear posture review, which I'm talking about tomorrow at 9 o'clock, it puts out new missions and new ways that this president could use these nuclear weapons. So for me, that is the number one threat we face in the world today. It's not a terrorist group. It's not a rogue regime. It's our own president.
Thank you. Heather, do you have the answer for the book title? Did you find it?
Can I just push back one little bit?
Oh,
or not? No, I mean, look, that turns politics into psychiatry, and I'm not sure it helps at all. We can believe whatever we want to believe. I mean, unless you can, unless you have a panel and multiple panels of psychiatrists who have examined and who have put him under the microscope, come on. This isn't the way. Half of the country voted for this man.
No, they didn't.
You don't call 48% half of the country? Oh, okay. Well, I'm sorry. My numbers are different than yours. But no, my point is that this doesn't really help the conversation. It really doesn't help the conversation. And I came here for one reason, and that is to conduct a conversation and not to get into this kind of personalization of politics.
So let me quickly, there are some follow-up questions, and Heather, you would.
So the book title is Why Civil Resistance Works, the Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict.
Yeah. Erica Chenoweth,
and Maria Stefan.
Chenoweth.
Why nonviolence why civil resistance works, the strategic logic of nonviolent conflict.
So may I just kind of push the questions? I think that there are two other questions that are very pertinent and that segue into what has been going on before very, very well. One of them is from a student, and this question is directed to Henry, that your talk reminds the student of Reagan's earlier speech at Westminster, and that your remarks seem to remind the student of a binary way of looking at the world in terms of darkness and light, right? evil and good. And don't you remember, and this is the student's question, that the United States has invaded very many Latin American democracies, such as Guatemala. So do you really care about democracy, or is there something else that we are after? And the other question, if I may just ask at the same time, maybe Larry and Joe would be, and Heather certainly is welcome to jump in, is this, and I think this is a very, very good question. The question is that the United States under Trump has backed out of the climate change accord. We have torn up or threatened to tear up the Iran deal, threatened NAFTA, withdrawn from TPP, and are we trustworthy? Are we trustworthy? If you look at the invasion of Iraq, we said they had weapons of mass destruction, and turned out they did not have. Whether we knew that they did not have them, and that's precisely the reason why we attacked, knowing that they did not have the means to hit back, or we did not know. Neither interpretation is good for us. And then Gaddafi gave up his facilities for mass destruction, weapons of mass, and then he got killed. And of course, Reagan has threatened to tear up the Iran deal. Why should North Korea believe that we are trustworthy? So these are the two questions that I would just, who would like to take on?
You had the first one about Reagan and the.
Maybe Reagan at Westminster. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Steve. Yeah. The question has to do with Reagan at Westminster in 1982 when he talked about democracy and freedom, and it was in the context, of course, of his later speech in March of 1983 when he called the Soviet Union the evil empire. Look, this distinction between a republic, which is based upon self-government, individual rights and self-government, and authoritarian societies who do not recognize such individual rights, that conflict has been there since the beginning of our country. And it suggests that in international affairs, regime type does matter. Jefferson once said that the real difference between a republic and an oligarchy, he said, is that the one uses coercion and the other uses consent. And it's still a very valid distinction between those regimes. If we were having this conversation in Russia, and I was opposing the Putin government, or you were opposing the Trump government, I mean, you'd be on somebody's list. They'd be following you around. Maybe, are they here? I don't know. I don't think so. We're actually calling for the conversation. We're calling for the disagreements. Our whole system is based on the notion that we relish disagreements because we could be wrong. I could be wrong. Heather could be wrong. Larry, Joe, Steve, any of us could be wrong. That's why we have each other. So that distinction is very important. I think that mattered to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan said, to Gorbachev when he first met him, he said, look, we don't distrust each other because we're armed. We're armed because we distrust each other's systems. We don't know if we can really believe what you're doing, and you don't know if you can really believe what we're doing. And that regime difference drives the arms race. That drives conflict. So it's one reason why when you spread democracy, if you can, at some reasonable cost, it makes for a better world because democracies do not threaten each other militarily. And that's not only substantiated in the statistics, it's evident in today's world. So I do think I make a distinction between, look, the world is messy, and I don't make any claims to purity, but I certainly see a big difference between the character of the American system and the character today of the Russian system or today of the Chinese system. And I'm not at all adverse to saying that one of them is my choice. And whether I want to use the words which, just generate a lot of good emotions, evil and good, I do think a republic is a good thing. And I think it's maybe a more moral way of structuring politics than an authoritarian regime.
Larry, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, not on that point because I agree entirely with Henry, so ditto. But actually on the trustworthy question, so I think there's two elements that I'd just like to touch on. One is the one that Heather referred to, which is consistency and policy. And that's important. But I think also, you mentioned the climate agreement. Obviously, this was a question of different positions in different administrations, and that is one of the challenges, I guess, in diplomacy when you're representing a democracy, is that you have different administrations, different presidents, and different policies. And so, when President Clinton sent Al Gore to do the Kyoto Agreement, they got the agreement, but they couldn't get it through Congress, and so we couldn't, we weren't able to fulfill that. So then we did finally get agreement for the Paris Accord, but we have a new president, and he doesn't like the accord, so he withdrew. That is going to happen, frankly, and it happens all the time, and we always had to deal with that as diplomats. But I have to say that most of our friends, and even some of our enemies, understand that. I mean, they know this is a democracy. Positions change because politics change, and it's driven by politics. I was talking to a friend of mine who was a foreign ministry official in Japan, and he was lamenting because at that time there was the politicians in Japan were pushing on foreign policy and were actually trying to get involved themselves in foreign policy. And he was complaining that these politicians were getting into policy and how terrible a thing that was. And I just laughed. I said, that's the way democracies work. They're supposed to get involved. And it means, yeah, it's messy, it's going to be a little inconsistent, but that's the way democracies work. And it's not necessarily a weakness in the long term. It's a challenge in the short term, but not a weakness in the long term. The second part of trustworthiness, though, is the ability to understand the other person's position and point of view, because that's how you develop common ground. So the business that I was in is developing common ground with another party so that you can get enough common ground to reach an agreement. That's what diplomacy is. And to do that, you have to be sincere in respecting the other person's view and understanding what they want to try to get out of it. And so I am a little concerned that President Trump, with the America First label, it makes it very difficult if you're a diplomat to go out and say, I mean, first of all, America First. All of my old counterparts would have said, "No kidding, yeah, we got that." I mean, it's been America First for the last 50 years in America, in diplomacy. So that was no surprise. What they didn't like, obviously, was the tone. That we're interested in our interests. We're not interested in you. We're interested in a transaction that's going to benefit us, and we don't care if it benefits you or not, because you've been getting your way, and now we're going to get our way. So that approach, and I know it's the Twitter approach, and it's not necessarily the way policy is working in every respect in Washington today, but it seems to be in many, is what worries me, because without that trust and without the ability for the other side to understand that you're trusting and that you at least understand their interests and know what they want to get out of something, you're not going to get agreements.
So Heather, any thoughts?
I actually want to come back to the student's question, because I think something was raised that it's really critical to acknowledge. Countries have interests, and there's actually not anything wrong with that. All countries have interests, and all countries act based on their interest. And there's really never or almost never a purely altruistic act in international politics. That's kind of not the nature of the beast. So a mistake that we make frequently on the topic of intervention across the board is to pretend to the public and to each other that it's all about some humanitarian reason when, in fact, it's about some other reason. And many times the other reason is actually quite legitimate, or at the very least seems legitimate to the supporters of the democratically elected government, which is how our system works. So we have failed, friends of intervention have failed by overselling both its humanitarian potential and its humanitarian reality. Now, the other point is, as I said earlier, we're not a perfect society. And yeah, you do lose a little credibility if you don't acknowledge that our country that loves democracy and the promotion of democracy did overthrow a number of functioning democracies. In some cases, frankly, in places that we'd give our eye teeth to have those regimes back now. And a thing that has changed rather dramatically since the period of the coup in Guatemala and other events that might come to mind that have changed since also the sort of successes in intervention that Henry mentioned in the immediate post-war period is the relative distribution of power. So it's not simply the case anymore that the U.S. can make something be true by saying it's true. as we were able to do in the immediate post-war period and again in the immediate post-Cold War period. So when that's not true, there's a much greater premium on intellectual honesty and carefulness and modesty of claims. And we are way out of practice with that as a society and as a governing culture.
That's great. Joe, do you want to say?
Yeah, thank you. Just building on Heather's comments, you know, we have to be honest about our interventionism. We have to be being willing to take a look at the whole picture of American interventionism when we talk about this. We tend to pick the good interventions, the ones we like. World War II, we intervened to stop Hitler, and that was a damn good thing we did. I don't know if there's anybody who would think, no, that we shouldn't have gotten involved. No, we had to get involved. We had to intervene in that European war, even though we were forced to do it because Japan attacked us. It made that intervention a little easier for us, and then we intervened in the Asian War. That was a good thing. But we've had dozens of interventions by America in Latin America and Central America, and none of those were about promoting democracy. None of those were for the good of the people. We put in place repeatedly dictators that put America's interest first, not your interest, not my interest. It was United Fruit's interest. And this is true. It's hard to look at the history of American involvement in Central and Latin America and not realize that that is what basically we did for a good 100 years in Latin America and Central America. And we intervened in Africa. We intervened in Iran, famously, in 1953, and overthrew the democratically elected leader of that country, Mohammad Mossadegh, and put in place a dictator, the Shah. Most Americans don't know that. Every Iranian knows it. Every Iranian knows it. And those histories of interventions weakened us in the world. Then, yes, they extended a military alliance. Yes, they built up this bulwark against communism, but at the cost of tarnishing the American image, of making people question the ideals we say we stand for. And we do it repeatedly. We do it repeatedly. So while I am focused on the horrors that the Trump presidency might release, and I really believe this. This is the worst administration I've seen in my lifetime. I am more worried about what is going to happen with this administration than anything I've ever been worried about. But while we focus on that, we have to understand the underlying sort of conservative philosophy that some of what Trump does is based on, including this idea of cheap interventionism. You know, we shouldn't get involved in big military adventures. Vietnam started off as a cheap intervention. So to the student's question, I constantly get worried about this black and white, that we stand for this and it's good, and we're opposing that and it's bad. Well, what exactly is Trump opposing? What's the bad in the world that he's opposing? When you look at it, it's not there. He's opposing a free press. He's opposing an independent judiciary. He's opposing an independent FBI. He's opposing a variety of pillars that we've come to take for granted in this country, and he now sees as a danger, as a threat that has to be fixed, the fake media, for example. I'm proud to call Madeleine Albright a friend, a colleague. I just saw her last week, and if you're a friend of Stephen Colbert, go watch the Colbert Show tonight, because she's going to be on with her new book. You know what her new book is about? It's not about American interventionism. It's called Fascism: A Warning. And it's based on her experience. And she's not calling Donald Trump a fascist, but she's calling some of the things that are being done now in the name of America, in the name of American independence, in the name of defending the country, in the name of putting us first, as the warning signs of what fascism looks like, of what fascism can accomplish. And this, more than anything else, is what worries me. Her book is out today. I don't think I've ever promoted somebody else's book while I've been up here. But I urge you to take a look at Madeleine Albright's book, or take a look at this, and understand where the real dangers lie and what the path was that got us here.
May I? Thank you. I know we have only maybe 2 minutes left. May I try to squeeze in one more question. I mean, it's related. I mean, and of course, you should feel free to leave. Two of the questions are very similar, namely that if our values are so great, and I'm quoting, why should people elsewhere not be standing up and try to steal them from us? Why should we use intervention? Should we not use persuasion? The other one, I think, is also a very important question. If we have to judge intervention by the likely cost, then why should we intervene in Ukraine? Because Russia will never give up Ukraine or Crimea, and the cost would be very heavy, and the prospect of success would be very dim. So I think that's directed at Henry, that question. If we really want to go after the lower hanging fruits, then Ukraine would be not the place to go. And Korea would not be the place to go. Any thoughts? Anyone?
Oh. Yeah. I thought he was summing up. I didn't know he was, I didn't know he was putting a question. Well, look, I mean, Ukraine is not going to be a low-cost, effort. If in fact we resist Russian aggression there, that's not going to be low cost. I mean, I think so far we've contained those costs, and the hope is that you can influence Putin by way of suggesting to him that any further actions of these sort are going to cost him more, and there'll be more body bags coming back to Moscow, etc. It's obviously a good thing to make him aware of. I would like to see Ukraine needs to be stabilized. I'm not looking for a solution there. I'm looking for a way to stabilize it, make sure that Russia doesn't try to extend the borders of the portions of Donetsk that they occupy, and then keep the negotiations going, because I think at some point this will become so costly the Russians will want some sort of an agreement. Keep open that option in the long term of Ukraine's right to choose either the EU or NATO. I mean, Korea, of course, could be a huge cost problem if it should get out of control. And look, everyone has their doubts about presidents when they're in power. People doubted JFK and his ability to manage the relationship with the Soviet Union. They did, and he had a very disastrous meeting with Khrushchev in 1961. So everybody can have their own opinion about the president, but I so far, as I've suggested, I think in terms of what Trump has done, I think he's handled himself pretty well, and we'll see. I don't think North Korea, by the way, will go to war or do anything without Chinese support. And I think for the moment, at least, maybe for the duration, Trump has pretty much cut that option off. So we're going to have negotiations of some sort. As Joe said, and I agree with him, I mean, the North Korean, obviously, nuclear program is much further along than the Iranian, so it's a much bigger threat to us. So we need to keep them at the negotiating table and find some way to ratchet this whole thing back, and then figure out what we can live with over the long term. Just as we have tried, we've decided what we can live with. At least Obama decided what we could live with in the case of Iran's nuclear program.
I'll take the values question actually quickly to wrap up, because if you think that democracy promotion or intervention is about spreading or sharing or promoting or pushing American values, you're doing it wrong. The way that democracy promotion works, the way that intervention works when it works, is finding places where values are shared and supporting people whose values and you understand implement those shared values in ways that work in their society. And I'll make a gratuitous concluding point that notion of shared values is what makes communities work, it's what makes countries work, it's what makes international alliances and organizations work, and it's why I actually think the biggest threat to the U.S. is not Donald Trump personally. I agree with Henry on that one, but it is with the sense that's being pushed by a minority of our fellow Americans that we don't have shared values as a society, and that is a much, much bigger threat to us than any of the things we've talked about.
Thank you. Larry and Joe, would you like to have some concluding comments?
We're done.
Done? Okay, thank you all. Thank you all very much.
We're done. We got to know when to end it. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being on. Thank you. Are you going to the dinner tonight? good. I'll see you at dinner. And
Go enjoy it again.
No,
That's important.
Thank you, Heather, for the plug.
Thank you. You're going to dinner tonight?
Added bonus that you
Added bonus, yeah.
Sure.
Wow, did you raise your hand?